When Gheorghe Faludi returned to Hungary in 1946, he found a country utterly shattered by war. The poet and author had fled 8 years before when, as a Jew, he was threatened by growing anti-Semitism and the country's links to the Nazis. Budapest, the capital he'd been born in and brought up in, was a city of rubble, dotted with partially buried corpses and the skeletons of buildings. It had changed in other, less visible ways too. Soon after his return, Gheorghe's publisher paid him for a new edition of one of his books. The amount? 300 billion pengus, the currency at the time. It sounds like a huge sum, but all he was able to buy with it were a chicken, 2 litres of oil, and some vegetables. And if he'd waited until the afternoon to spend it, he wouldn't have even got that. Why? Because Hungary was in the grip of the worst inflation ever recorded. At its peak, it reached 41.9 quadrillion %. On the ground, that meant average prices doubling about every 15 hours. Millions of Hungarians saw their real wages and living standards plummet, plunging many into a new fight for survival. By the time the price spiral was brought under control, the total value of all pengus in circulation in the entire country was a fraction of 1 American cent. Many of us are concerned about inflation right now, so it seems a timely moment to focus this week's episode of the Forum from the BBC World Service on what caused the worst hyperinflation in history. How did these staggering price rises affect ordinary people, the meaning of money and the rhythms of daily life? And how was the chaos brought to an end almost overnight? I'm Bridget Kendall, and as usual, I'm joined by 3 expert guests with the answers to all these questions. Bela Tomka is Professor of Modern Social and Economic History at the University of Szeged in Hungary. Laszlo Borhi is the Peter A. Kadras Chair and Associate Professor in the Department of Central Eurasian Studies at the Hamilton-Lugar School at Indiana University in the United States. And Pierre Siklos is Professor of Economics at Wilfrid Laurier University in Waterloo, Canada. Welcome to you all, and let's start with one of the most curious aspects of this story, not the staggering numbers or the many records broken, but why this crisis isn't better known. When it comes to historical hyperinflations, some of our listeners might well have heard about the one in Weimar, Germany in the 1920s, but I imagine very few knew about Hungary. I have to admit, I certainly didn't before making this programme, and I wonder why that is. Bela, what do you think?
Well, first, the period of hyperinflation was relatively short. It lasted from the spring of 1945 to the summer of 1946, hardly more than a year. Even more importantly, the hyperinflation period was immediately preceded by the Second World War, which caused enormous destruction in Hungary. Then, from the late 1940s, Stalinist regime with all its repressiveness was established in the country. In other words, hyperinflation in Hungary was wedged between 2 dramatic historical periods, and these periods somehow overshadowed the years in between.
Have you ever spoken to anyone, Laszlo, who lived during that time, about what it was like?
Oh, of course, my parents would talk about it. Of course, they were children at the time, but they would tell me that they saw people sweeping up the currency on the streets. So when the forint was introduced in 1946, people just discarded the old currency pengur, which was basically worthless, and the road sweepers would put it into dumpsters. Whatever little was left of the family fortune was erased by the hyperinflation. So people basically lost what savings they had and had to start from scratch. And just to go back to previous question a little bit, why doesn't the world know about the largest hyperinflation in human history? Because history is mainly written by the big guys, by the United States, by Russia, Germany, and what happens to the little guys, the small countries, is often not known or not remembered.
Before we go any further, let's explain a couple of key terms. Inflation, as we know, is the general increase in the price of goods and services and, by extension, the fall in the purchasing power of money. That's what inflation is. But why does it happen? Pierre, there are many reasons, aren't there? But can you take us through some of the main ones?
At the base of all the inflation that we are experiencing today as well, is the demand for goods and services outstrips the availability or the supply of these goods and services. And typically there's some kind of a shock that precedes it. And in the case of Hungary, it was war, but more recently we've had oil price shocks, especially in the 1970s, and more recently now we still have the ongoing pandemic and, of course, the war in Ukraine. And now the imbalance is in the direction of too much money chasing too few goods, prices go up. Of course, it used to be the case, and certainly in Hungary's case, it was literally the printing presses printing too much money. More recently, though, it's done digitally.
We've talked about inflation. What about the second term, hyperinflation? What specifically does this mean? Is there a definition?
Well, there's a definition that economists use. It's sort of the rough consensus, and usually it's considered to be a 50% rise in prices on a monthly basis.
Okay, let's get to Hungary specifically and try to understand in a bit more detail where this record-breaking hyperinflation came from. We'll start with World War II, which had devastated the country's economy and its people. Laszlo, can you briefly start by taking us through Hungary's role in the conflict? Whose side was it on and why?
Hungary was on the side of the Axis, that is, Hungary was Germany's ally, and mainly in the chase of territory with Romania, and both countries were vying for the province we now call Transylvania. Earlier, before the First World War, it was part of Hungary. It was attached to Romania in 1918, and Hungary lost two-thirds of its land in the Treaty of Trianon in 1920, and Hungary's foreign policy between the interwar period was about recuperating all or at least some of the territories lost to the neighboring countries, Romania, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, and even Austria. After 1938, Hungary got closer and closer to German foreign policy, eventually became dominated by German foreign policy, and in 1941, Hungary took part in the attack on the Soviet Union. Now, in 1942, the country's leaders began to realize that Germany would lose the war. So just like Romania and Finland, they began secret negotiations with the Western allies, to some extent even the Soviet Union, to jump out of the war. Now, that didn't happen. What did happen, though, was that Hitler got wind of these secret negotiations, and in March 1944, Germany invaded Hungary and installed an absolutely pro-Nazi administration. And the horrendous consequence of that was that 437,000 Hungarian Jews were deported to Auschwitz. And after that, Hungary became a major battleground in the Second World War. Hitler declared Hungary part of his fortress Europe. Budapest experienced one of the biggest sieges of the Second World War. 80,000 Soviet troops lost their lives to take the city, and 40,000 German and Hungarian defenders, tens of thousands of civilians. In Budapest, the city was reduced to rubble.
The bombing was constant. It was very dangerous to go outside. Many people died while running for water or just going to the courtyard for a cigarette. We went down into the cellar on the 29th of December, and until the fall of Buda on the 12th of February, we lived a rat's life. Apart from the windows, it's a miracle our flat remained intact. In our immediate neighborhood, everything was completely destroyed by mines and bullets.
And it's right, isn't it, that railway lines were destroyed and all of the bridges over the Danube were out of action and roads were destroyed too.
Exactly. I mean, the Germans, in the last desperate effort to defend the Buda side of the capital, blew up the bridges spanning the Danube, those very beautiful bridges, and people were just about to were crossing the bridge, and there are many images of that, perished, either by falling into the Danube and drowning or due to the detonation. But and the Soviets tried to get the Germans to surrender the city, and their emissaries were murdered by German fire. So basically it was a situation when the Germans were desperately trying to hang on to the city, partly to defend the Hungarian oil fields. Hungary was a major producer of oil, meaning to say that after the loss of the Romanian oil fields, Hungary was the last resource of oil for the German army. Another very symbolic reason why Budapest suffered this devastating siege was a political decision made by Joseph Stalin, the Soviet Union's leader. Because once the Soviet army approached the capital city, the commander of the Second Ukrainian Front, Marshal Malinovsky, phoned Stalin and said, "Comrade Stalin, I have to have a few weeks before I can launch a final attack on Budapest because I need my armies to recuperate. I want my logistics to be in place." And Stalin just told him, "Comrade Malinovsky, your political commissar has just told me that the German and Hungarian forces are spent. I want you to take the capital city on by November the 7th. And of course, November the 7th is the anniversary of the Great October Revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution. And Stalin wished to celebrate that event by capturing this major Central European city. So Malinovsky was forced to launch his offensive prematurely. The offensive failed. The Hungarians and the German defenders were able to build a defensive line around the capital city, and that resulted in this devastating siege of Budapest. So both Hitler's and Stalin's partially politically, partially military-dominated decisions led to this devastating outcome.
Well, Laszlo, you've explained how the capital, Budapest, bore the brunt of the fighting and the damage. Can you paint us a picture of what the scale of the economic destruction was as a result of the war?
70% of Budapest's buildings were completely destroyed or partially destroyed. The damage to the national economy was $4.5 billion. That may not mean very much, but to put that into perspective, in 1947 the country's national income was $1.2 billion. Even in 1947, the industrial production of the country was about only 35% of the 1938 level. In addition to that, the Germans took out about $1 billion worth of goods and commodities out of the country. Basically, the country was close to famine. The Soviets contributed to that by the fact that the million men that they stationed in the country was feeding off the land. Hungary had to support the nourishment of the Red Army. And we are talking about 1 million men in a country of 9 million, and the Hungarian budget had to foot the whole bill, that is feeding the Red Army and so on.
And on top of all that, when the war was over and Hungary signed the armistice on January the 20th, 1945, it went on to be ordered to pay punishing reparations for its part in the conflict, right?
Exactly, $200 million, but the Soviets calculated it in such a way that the country actually paid at least 3 times more, about $600 million. And that wasn't even the biggest problem. The biggest problem was that the Soviets determined the price that they were willing to pay for reparation commodities. So let's say, and this is a specific example, a floating crane that the Soviets demanded would cost, let's say, $100,000 on the world market price, but the Soviets were willing to count only $30,000 for it. So they demanded 3 for 1. And finally, just like in other Soviet-occupied countries, it was the Soviet Union's policy to dismantle industry and take it back to the Soviet Union for the Soviet economy's reconstruction. So basically, while the Soviets expected Hungarian industry to produce for reparations, at the same time the Soviet Union would remove about $1.2, $1.3 billion of equipment from Hungary. And in fact, the U.S. ambassador in Moscow predicted that reparations would lead to the Soviet economic colonization of the countries that the Soviet Union occupied after the Second World War. And in fact, economic expansion was a very conscious part of Soviet expansion after the Second World War. Soviet expansion into Central Europe, an expansion that reached the largest extent of Moscow's influence on Europe in Russian history.
So, Pierre, how precarious were the Hungarian government's finances at this point?
They were as precarious as you can imagine, since essentially you could not, there was no taxation system in place when the armistice was signed, and the prospect of raising taxes through conventional means was not possible. It would not be possible for months. Certainly for the first several months, starting mid-1945, easily 90%, perhaps even higher, of the revenue would have to be generated through the printing press, through inflation.
Laszlo, you wanted to add something?
It's often interesting to look at the black market price of the US dollar as an indicator of the state of the finances of a country. In July 1945, on the black market, you had to pay 1,300 pengős for a dollar. By December, this was 290,000 pengős for a single dollar.
That's pretty telling, yeah. Bella, we've heard how Hungary managed to stay out of the worst of the fighting till the end of the war. But even then, and especially after the fighting intensified, the war must have had a huge impact on the country's population.
Well, the overall picture presented by Laszlo is very accurate. But of course, the war brought about other miseries as well. From a pre-war population of less than 9 million, Hungary lost 1 million, including soldiers and civilians. The occupying Soviets were very harsh. They committed hundreds of thousands of rapes, abducted civilians, and sent them to forced labor to the Soviet Gulag. So all these circumstances were really severe.
By December 1944, living conditions in Budapest were deteriorating rapidly and food was becoming more scarce, especially fresh meat. Here's a report from one eyewitness when a pig farm in the south of the capital was evacuated and its animals escaped.
People were sawing at the throats of the poor animals with penknives and dragging them away half dead. Those pigs still alive were licking the blood of the others in their hunger, while their heads were being bashed in with rocks. A soldier also took part in this terrible hunt. People were asking him to shoot the pigs, and he pumped them off for 50 to 100 pengős.
It's a horrific picture. Bella, what impact did the war have on people's daily lives, on their income, on their jobs, on their standard of living?
Notably, the urban population had problems in getting the most basic goods, in particular food. The vast majority of people spent all their time trying to somehow get the food they needed for themselves or for their families. In 1945-46, the average daily calorie intake per inhabitant was some 1,700 calories, well below the recommended 3,000 calories per day. We must remember that these times many people were doing really hard manual labor, which required a lot of calories. A food rationing system, basically a food stamp system, was introduced, which favored those doing heavy physical manual work.
Laszlo.
In addition to that, there was a tremendous demographic problem, partially due to the war deaths on the battlefield, deaths of civilians in fighting, obviously the Holocaust. But what is lesser known is that the Soviet Union had 600,000 Hungarian POWs in Soviet camps after 1945, and many of these people were not actual POWs, but civilians randomly rounded up in the streets of Hungarian villages and towns, and most of them would not return until the end of the 1940s. So there's actually a labor shortage, and many families lost the father, lost the mother, children were orphaned, and basically lost the people who could make a living for the family. So you're talking about 600,000 people out of 9 million, and we will never know the final figure, but approximately 150 to 200,000 people never came back because they perished in Soviet camps.
Pierre, what had happened to the cost of living during the war years and why? Had it already spiraled out of control before the war ended?
So it has to be made clear that a lot of the data that we have is dominated by what we know happened in Budapest, and Budapest plays a disproportionately large role in this story. The second thing that should be made clear is that, of course, measurement of prices and quantities was not as precise, perhaps, as it is today. So with that in mind, when we make a distinction between inflation and hyperinflation, we have to wait till the middle of 1945 before that threshold is reached. But clearly, inflation was rising very quickly. So the prospect of a hyperinflation was already in place. And of course, as is known by some economic historians, Hungary has the distinction of having two hyperinflations in the 20th century.
Yes, I was going to mention that this wasn't the first time Hungary had experienced very high or hyperinflation. Like many other nations, prices rose out of control after the end of World War I. Bella, can you tell us what happened at that point?
Hungary was not directly devastated by the First World War, but wartime industrial capacities had to be converted to peace production, and that involved huge costs. Hungarian governments financed the war by huge loans, and these loans had to be repaid. The Austro-Hungarian monarchy was dissolved, and its common market was abolished, which disrupted foreign trade. The Treaty of Trianon, as suggested by László, reduced the territory of Hungary to 1/3 and its population to about the half. And for a time, part of the country was under Romanian occupation. All these factors contributed to the economic disorganization. So the government had to resort to money printing. But the reconstruction was quite successful in the 1920s. And the interwar years in general were quite prosperous period. This decade, especially until the Great Depression, also brought considerable social progress. For example, health insurance coverage was greatly expanded. A compulsory pension scheme was introduced, although it only covered industrial workers. And it's quite symptomatic that the average life expectancy increased greatly. For example, for men from 40 years in 1910 to 49 years in 1930. That's a huge improvement. The country can be considered as a moderately developed country by contemporary European standards. In addition, the country was characterized by large social disparities on the eve of the Second World War. In particular, the agricultural workers were socially disadvantaged.
If I may interject from the economic perspective, that in the interwar years, Hungary would have some assistance from foreign loans and briefly from the League of Nations. The first hyperinflation was nowhere near as severe, and it was ended like most hyperinflations are ended, which is a credible set of policies.
And so this is where they introduced a new currency, the pengu, which actually went on to be a very stable currency. So, Pierre, bring us back up to speed of where Hungary is when World War II ends in Europe in May 1945. Briefly, what's the situation with Hungary's currency, the penga? How bad has it got?
Prices began to rise. By our standards, they were fairly high, but they were well below the threshold of 50% per month inflation. But they rose very quickly, and so you can see that from the denominations of the penga would rise. We're not talking about months or years, but weeks when new denominations would be introduced that would be 10 times higher than the weeks before.
We've heard how Hungary responded to rapidly rising prices after World War I. This time, what was the government's response?
The government faced the need to try to provide some services, but there was no infrastructure in place that would allow it to raise revenues in the conventional manner. And so all it could do was to not only print more money, but increase the denominations, and eventually even that would not be enough.
And is this the government who's doing this, or the central bank, or actually at that point in Hungary does it amount to the same thing?
At that point it amounts to the same thing, because many years earlier they passed legislation to say that in the national interest the government could use the central bank as a source of borrowing money. And so by then, of course, the distinction between the central bank and the government was meaningless.
And Laszlo, there were no loans this time to help the Hungarians recover as there'd been after World War I.
Exactly. So the Soviet-controlled countries, including those who were parts of the United Nations like Poland and Czechoslovakia, were barred by the Soviet Union from taking part in the very generous Marshall Plan that basically jump-started West European economic recovery. And that made life incredibly difficult because in addition to economic reconstruction, there was a Soviet-imposed policy of super-industrialization, basically the militarization of these economies, because Stalin was preparing for a Third World War, and the funds had to come from the countryside at the expense of food production.
Pierre, the government did try to dampen inflation at the end of 1945, didn't it, by imposing what amounted to a 75% tax on the currency?
Yes, that's right. What they did was to say that if you hold a particular note, they would place a stamp on this note, and the stamp would devalue the note by 75%, and that 75% would be retained by the government. But on the ground, it was quite clear that there was nothing on the streets or in the economy that led the general public to believe that there would be an ample amount of goods and services available to be purchased, and so there was no credibility.
Was it not also the case that Hungarians could evade it by depositing money in a bank account because the tax only applied to bank notes?
That's right, but as you know, even today, conventional bank accounts don't return enough interest income to offset inflation. And keep in mind that when inflation rates are, by that stage, they were well over 50% per month, the trip to the bank and the withdrawal itself of notes would result in a sizable loss of purchasing power. So it wasn't a big help.
And then the government introduced a new currency, right? The adópengo, or tax pengo.
It wasn't so much a new currency as an attempt to get ahead of the rising inflation rate. So what they did was to decide that we're going to create an index largely based on a basket mostly of foodstuffs in Budapest. And instead of having to change the denomination of the notes, they would henceforth say 100, let's say, adópengo would be worth 110 the next day if prices rose by 10% the next day. But that index was based on prices in Budapest the 2 days previous. And so there was a gap between what was actually happening to prices on the ground and the index itself. And of course that gap would grow increasingly large, and so they would resort to increasing the denomination of the tax pengo because it couldn't keep up with the price increases.
And Bella, what was happening to workers' wages at this point? Presumably they wouldn't be keeping up with rising prices, so how were people coping?
Many companies started to pay in kind, in potatoes, in sugar, in flour, or simply in the goods the companies produced. So then the employees themselves had to exchange these goods for food or other necessities. Actually, for the first and only time in the history of inflation in the world, companies had to provide a certain quantity and quality of food in kind, once again, determined by the weekly calorie needs of workers and their dependent family members. This measure could not really solve the problems because the factories could not get all the food they needed due to shortages. But for a time, it did provide a minimum allowance for the working masses. Quite interestingly, the textile factories, for example, developed their own so-called centimeter wage system. Accordingly, the hourly wage became an average of 2 centimeters of textile. So people were really imaginative how to adjust to these extraordinary circumstances.
And what actually we haven't mentioned so far is that what also drove the hyperinflation is that the trade unions were empowered after 1945 by the Social Democrats and the Communists, and obviously they clamored for more wages, not realizing that this push for higher wages would actually accelerate inflation.
And isn't it right that at a certain point workers could even insist they were only paid in the morning because by the afternoon their wages were worth less?
Exactly. A law was stipulated that any wage earner could refuse to be paid if it was tendered later than 2 p.m. and could insist on being paid the following day at the daily rate of the tax penge. But after a while, this did not help much. In the final phase, exchange was only in kind, not measured in monetary terms. The black market flourished, and those who had any wealth left converted it into gold or foreign currency, even though using them was illegal.
Nonetheless, it seems the deprivation wasn't shared equally. Here's a New York Times report from Budapest in early April 1946.
Nowhere else in Europe could such a violent contrast be found between the standard of living of most of the population and that of those few who have become friendly with the British and Americans or, by some other means, have gained access to expensive restaurants. In the clubs of the occupying powers, you will find food as nowhere else in Europe. Rare fruits, goose, chicken, cream, and pastries as in the most extravagant hotels before the war.
So, Bella, does that mean that the struggles we're talking about were really only faced by the poorest in society?
Well, to some extent. Those who accumulated wealth, such as jewelry, gold, or other valuables, could sell these assets or exchange for food or other basic necessities. Also, similarly to this, those people that had access to foreign currency, either because they worked for a foreign embassy or company or other institution, could better survive. The rural population who had produced food were in a more favorable position. So basically the poor people in towns and cities suffered most.
As the government tried to keep up with the rocketing prices, it issued a dizzying array of new notes with ever higher numbers of zeros at the end of them. In the end, ordinary people started referring to the colour of the notes rather than their actual value. Pierre, can you tell us more?
That's right. The prices were rising so quickly that the actual denomination was largely meaningless. You'd have something like 100, and then you'd have millions and billions of millions attached to the number. So it was hard to tell just by looking at the note actually what the note was worth, not to mention the fact that the Adopenger system was in place, so you'd have to consult an actual index to find out what the nominal value of that note was. So it became largely impossible. All that was left was the color of the note, which was a somewhat easier way of identifying the nominal value of the note.
I understand that a milliard pengo was lavender, and a milliard mil pengo was blue, and a milliard bill pengo was green. So you would look at the value and just say, I've got 2 blues and a green for a loaf of bread. It sounds bizarre, but you can see why it happened that way. Pierre, do you know what the highest denomination was?
According to what I was able to find out, the largest denomination was 1 million billion penger. And that was issued on the 24th of May, 46.
It's quite hard to take it in, isn't it?
It is.
And they were unable to print it quickly enough, so they just stamped over it. So you had a trillion penger, and they put a stamp on it that now it's a quadrillion. So what people ended up doing was that they went to the market and let's say they wanted a dozen eggs. The seller would measure the weight of the eggs and the buyer would have to produce the amount of currency which weighed the same as the eggs did. So if it weighed, let's say, 2 ounces, then you would have to pay with 2 ounces of currency because numbers and colors no longer made any sense.
Pierre, we mentioned earlier the government's role in this inflation spiral, and it would be easy to see all this as its mistake. But there are some who've suggested it could have been a deliberate policy to try and reinvigorate Hungary's economy.
Well, I suppose that some inflation provides some incentive for economic activity, and there's a perennial discussion about what that inflation rate ought to be. But here we're talking about inflation rates that are many, many times higher. Now, the government, even though it was increasingly influenced by the Soviets as time wore on, knew that it was running out of time and that at some point the economic system, or at least the financial system, would collapse entirely, and the revenue that it was able to generate through inflation would evaporate. In fact, by April, certainly by May 1946, the purchasing power of the revenue it could generate through inflation was largely dissipated.
And then, incredibly and almost overnight, hyperinflation was brought to an end in the summer of 1946. So how did that happen, Pierre?
So preparations took some months. In other words, it wasn't overnight that the government said, this is what we're going to do. We're going to introduce a new currency called the forint, and we promise that we won't use the printing press to finance our revenues. Slowly but surely, economic activity was improving. It helped that there were small events such as the gold that was removed before the war was returned with great fanfare. And slowly but surely, they were starting to stockpile foodstuffs to make sure that when the new currency was launched, that at least markets appeared to be plentiful. They weren't plentiful everywhere, but they were plentiful enough that the reform was thought to be largely credible. And I think there was an attempt in the weeks leading up to the reform to convince the public that the reliance on the inflation tax would end, that there would no longer be any indexation of any kind, and that they would maintain those policies for the foreseeable future. So they were able to instill enough confidence in the public that the government was committed that the forint would retain its value.
So one critical factor in this was the return of the gold. This was the gold which had been held by the Nazis, right?
In actual fact, no. The gold reserve of the Hungarian National Bank was taken out of the country in the final phases of the war so that the Soviet army could not seize it. And it ended up in the American zone of occupation of Austria. And in 1946, a Hungarian government delegation went to Washington, D.C. on an official visit, and President Truman, as a gesture to the Hungarians, agreed for the return of the full gold reserve of the Hungarian National Bank. So that was a key moment in financial stabilization.
And here's how that moment was reported by the Associated Press on August the 6th, 1946.
Adolf Hitler's former private train arrived here today with 33 million in gold, the entire captured reserves of the Hungarian National Bank, to bolster Hungary's new financial structure. The 22-ton shipment of gold, bullion, and coins brought from Germany under heavy guard and military secrecy marked the first wholesale return of currency assets to an enemy country. Hungarian authorities voiced strong hopes that the arrival of the gold, 100% intact, would save their nation's shattered economy.
So, Laszlo, is that right, that Adolf Hitler's former private train?
Oh, yeah, that's quite ironic, yes, that it happened that way. And in that train, yeah, that's absolutely precise, as far as I know.
So the return of the gold was a big moment, but Hungary's political and economic landscape by now was fully within the Soviet sphere of influence. Isn't that right, Laszlo?
Oh, exactly. So in May 1946, the Hungarian Communist Party leader, Mátyás Rákosi, gave the order to implement the clone of the Stalinist system simultaneously and partially, in actual fact, to prepare the stabilization of the currency. They took steps to the economic centralization. So, for instance, Raw materials and semi-finished goods were centrally allocated even to private companies. They began to pressurize foreign-owned companies, American, Swiss, Austrian, British, and so on and so on. Eventually, together with domestic companies, they were nationalized without any kind of compensation. Simultaneously with other measures taken to introduce a central command economy, prices and wages were centralized. So it was a central price office that determined the cost of every commodity, basically. And the government also controlled the wages to be paid. So they actually came out with a table that determined the wage for every single sector of the economy. So this was very, very strictly controlled. And that probably helped rein in inflation.
Yes, in those economies, inflation or prices ceased to convey any signal about availability, and it became the economics of shortages.
So, Pierre, if by the end of 1948 the economy has been largely nationalized under Soviet influence, what are we to make of the end of this period of hyperinflation? Can we really rely or read reliably inflation statistics?
The simple answer is no. But the initial success of the reforms, I think, can be explained by the credible set of policies that was introduced at the time. Then things would, of course, change.
Are there any lessons to learn from all of this, Pierre, about how to deal with spiralling inflation? Many countries around the world have had to deal with hyperinflation at some point or another and may be grappling with it right now.
I suppose the common element is, first, when economic conditions break down, it doesn't take long when governments don't have other resources available to them for hyperinflation to take hold. I guess the second lesson is that if you introduce a set of policies that convince the public that you will ensure that the purchasing power of money will remain fairly stable, inflation can end fairly quickly.
I suppose also the example of Hungary and indeed other places around the world who've been through traumas of hyperinflation often shows how resilient people can be and ingenious in getting around some of the travails that hyperinflation visits on them. Bella, a final thought from you. What do you think this teaches us about the value of money, especially in the minds of ordinary people?
Well, Pierre already talked about credibility. I think public confidence in political and economic institutions, and by extension in the money itself, is a major condition for the stability of currency. If this trust evaporates in large segments of society, then recovering the confidence involves huge economic and social costs.
Thanks very much to all three of you. This has been a programme where I have certainly learned a lot, and I'm sure many of our other listeners have too. And if you are listening and would like to tell us what you think about what you've heard, do let us know by emailing the forum at bbc.co.uk. But for now, from me, Bridget Kendall, thanks for listening, and join us again next week.